I need to tell you about an object the size of your hand. It was found in a rock shelter called Abri Blanchard in the Dordogne Valley of southern France. It's a piece of eagle bone, flat, slightly curved, ivory-colored from age. Pressed into its surface, in a line that curves back and forth across the length of the bone, are 69 marks. Not decorations, not tallies of kills. When a researcher named Alexander Marshack spent 3 years examining this object in the early 1970s, mapping each mark under a microscope, measuring angles and depths and spacing, he found something that stopped him. The marks tracked the lunar cycle. Across 2.5 months of nights, the object was made 25,000 years ago. Someone, in a rock shelter in France at the height of the last ice age, was keeping a calendar. That sentence takes a moment to land. A calendar. Not carved into a monument, not written on a wall, held in one hand, small enough to slip into a fold of animal skin and carry anywhere, worn from handling. Before the first city, before the first written word, before any institution we recognize as civilization existed anywhere on Earth. The assumption we carry, usually without examining it, is that early humans lived inside the present tense. That tracking time, yesterday, tomorrow, the cycle of the moon, was a skill that emerged alongside farming, alongside settlements, alongside the practical need to predict harvests and plan seasons. The Abri Blanchard bone says that assumption is wrong. The person who made this object was not building a civilization. They were thinking about tonight, and tomorrow night, and the night after that. They wanted to know where they were inside the month, inside the rhythm of the moon that governed tides, animal movement, the growth cycles of plants. They made a tool for that knowledge, a tool small enough to hold in one hand, precise enough to be useful, and used. The wear on the surface shows repeated handling over time. This was not made and put away. It was used constantly. Marshack's analysis, published in Science in 1972 and refined with microscopy in subsequent work, identified the 69 marks as representing 2.5 lunar cycles. The marks change character across the bone, made with different tools, at different angles, in what appears to be a sequence of sitting down and adding one more on separate occasions. This is not decoration. Decorative marks tend to be rhythmically even and made in one session. These were not. These were cumulative. Each mark was added separately, at a different time, by a person returning to the same object night after night. The Dordogne Valley was, 25,000 years ago, one of the most densely inhabited regions of the world. The river valleys offered shelter, reliable water, and game. People lived here across multiple winters. They came back. At least one of them was counting the nights. You're sitting against the rock wall of the shelter. It's evening. You can tell by the way the light outside has shifted from orange to gray, and the temperature has dropped fast the way it does in winter. You have a small fire. The bone is in your left hand, a flint point in your right. You press the point in and drag it. One mark. The same as last night. The same as the night before that. You know exactly where you are in the count. The bone is familiar in your hand now, not just as an object, but as a sequence. You know each section of it, where you are in the curve of the pattern, how many marks remain before the full moon comes back. This is not a primitive instinct. This is a person who built themselves a tool and used it every night. The Abri Blanchard bone is not alone. Multiple incised bones from the same broad period, Aurignacian and Gravettian cultures, spanning roughly 30,000 to 25,000 BCE, show similar patterns at sites across France, Germany, and the Czech Republic. Not identical marks, but the same underlying principle: sequential notation over time, following what appears to be lunar tracking. A bone discovered at a site in the Dordogne, dating to 30,000 BCE, shows a comparable serpentine pattern to the Abri Blanchard piece. The pattern is not a coincidence. It is a practice. People spread across a wide area of Europe, across thousands of years, were doing the same thing, picking up portable objects, marking time on them, night by night, through each lunar cycle. What this means is that calendar keeping was not invented once by one clever person in one place. It was something people arrived at repeatedly and independently, an obvious answer to a practical problem that anyone living outdoors faces. When is the full moon? When is the dark period? When can I expect the tide to be highest? The bone is the answer, built up night by night. Researchers studying this body of evidence point to what that pattern implies. Sequential time tracking across multiple cultures, multiple centuries, multiple languages and landscapes. The cognitive capacity it requires, abstract representation of time, notation, planning across weeks, was not rare. It was normal, expected. A skill people carried as a matter of course. Something we treat as a marker of modern intelligence was a daily habit for hunter-gatherers living in rock shelters during an ice age. They just didn't have paper. Think about what it actually required, practically, to make one of these objects. You needed to notice the moon first. Not just glance at it, track it across enough nights to understand the cycle. That takes at minimum 1 full month of observation before you can even begin marking. The person who made the Abri Blanchard bone had been carrying this knowledge in their head before they put it on the bone. The bone was not where the calendar started. It was where it became reliable. Then the materials. A bone flat enough to mark on. A flint point fine enough not to crack it. The discipline to do the same thing every evening, or close enough that you could reconstruct a missed night and catch up. And here is the thing that changes the feeling of all of this. Nobody told them to. No institution required it. No agricultural cycle depended on it. No harvest to prepare for, no planting season to calculate. These were hunter-gatherers at the peak of an ice age. The moon mattered to them because they moved through a landscape governed by it. But no one was keeping a record. No one was checking their work. No one would have noticed if they stopped. They decided, on their own, that knowing what night it was mattered enough to build a system for it. Nobody was going to check their work. They built the system anyway. Picture the habit of it. Every evening, when the light shifted and the cold came, someone picked up that bone. Checked where they were in the sequence, added 1 mark, or just confirmed the count. Set it down. Night after night after night. The bone shows wear from being gripped repeatedly. It was not a display object. It was not ceremonial. It was a daily tool. A calendar for a person who had no written language, no institution of timekeeping, no shared system to anchor them into. Just the bone. And the moon. And the practice of returning to both every evening. When that person died, the bone stayed in the rock shelter. It stayed for 25,000 years. Until someone with a trowel and a magnifying glass picked it up and spent 3 years figuring out what it meant. What it means is simple. This was a daily object. A pocket calendar for someone who had no pockets. And the thing they used every night to know where they were in time became the only evidence they existed at all. The Abri Blanchard bone is in a French museum now, catalogued, photographed, analyzed. What it contains has no official category. It is a record of someone's private habit, the small, daily act of knowing what night it was. Not profound, not ceremonial, just useful. The person who made it never wrote their name, never built anything that survived. We have the bone and nothing else. But the bone is enough. It tells us that 25,000 years ago, someone sat down each night and chose to know. Not because they had to, because knowing mattered to them. That's not a prehistoric instinct. That's a very human one.